History remembers wars by the battles that defined them, by the maps redrawn, the nations rebuilt, the flags raised in victory. But beneath those headlines lie moments that never make it to the books, and moments that belong only to the silence between heartbeats. One of those moments was a young nurse holding the hand of a dying enemy in a snowbound tent. No medals were given for it. No speeches were made. Yet it carried the weight of everything humanity still hoped to be. War strips people to their essence. It tears away language, country, ideology, until what remains is one person trying to comfort another as the world collapses around them. That perhaps is the truest kind of courage. Not the act of killing, but the act of caring when everything tells you not to. The nurse never saw herself as a hero. She never sought recognition. But her small defiance and refusing to let hate define her was a victory of another kind. It was the kind that doesn't end when the shooting stops. Her words, "You don't have to be brave anymore, Nyanar," were meant for him. But in time they came to speak for millions. For the soldiers who returned home broken, for the nurses who couldn't forget, for every survivor who learned that surviving was its own kind of battle. In the long shadow of history, that sentence became something greater, a truth about war itself. That even amid destruction, compassion endures. That even among enemies, humanity survives. The fields of the Ardennes are quiet now. The snow falls softly over the forest where men once died for inches of frozen ground. Tourists walk among memorials reading names carved in stone. But the names that matter most are the ones history never learned. Somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear it still. The soft whisper of a nurse to a dying boy. Reminding the world that mercy can exist even in hell, because wars end. Nations heal. But compassion, that fragile, stubborn spark, is what makes humanity worth saving. Knows the plasma will run out. She knows her commander may not approve. And she also knows the man in front of her is no longer a soldier, just a patient. That was the world of the field nurse. A moral battlefield inside a physical one. The German wounded brought their own stories. Some were fanatics, still swearing loyalty to Hitler even as they bled out. Others wept quietly, asking if their families would ever know where they fell. Prisoners from the Waffen-SS were often feared and despised, yet even they were bandaged, treated, and sometimes prayed for by the same hands that had just tended Allied soldiers. This duality broke many nurses. Psychologists would later call it moral injury, the pain of doing what is right when the world demands something else. But in 1944, no one had a name for it. Letters home were censored, yet many nurses found ways to express what they could not say out loud. One wrote from Belgium, "War makes you forget faces. They all become eyes looking at you, asking the same question, 'Will I live?' Sometimes I lie because that's the only mercy left." It was within that silence, between duty and mercy, that our story takes shape. The nurse in Bastogne, tending to a young enemy soldier, was not extraordinary. She was every nurse who ever looked at suffering and saw a person instead of a flag. Her field hospital existed because of the Medical Corps' mobile surgical units. Small, transportable hospitals that could be set up near the front line. These units revolutionized wartime medicine. The introduction of penicillin and blood plasma transfusions had begun saving thousands of lives. But even with such advancements, there was no substitute for the human touch. It was the nurse's voice, steady and calm, that kept men anchored between pain and oblivion. Her hands delivered more comfort than medicine ever could. When historians speak of war, they count tanks, shells, and divisions. They forget the quiet wars fought in canvas tents, wars where the weapon was compassion. By Christmas 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had become the bloodiest engagement ever fought by the U.S. Army. Over 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. Yet amid the devastation inside that one field hospital, a single act of empathy cut through the cold. And it began with a dying man asking a question no soldier was supposed to ask, about his family, his fear, and the truth that awaited him. War is made of numbers, but it's remembered through faces. The nurse in that tent was one among thousands, yet her exhaustion tells the story of all of them. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours in 3 days. Her gloves were stiff with frozen blood, and her hair smelled of ether and gunpowder. Every movement was automatic. Check pulse, bandage, stop bleeding, whisper calmness. She had long stopped counting the men she'd seen die. At first, she had prayed over them. By December, she had no words left. What she did have was silence, a silence that held more mercy than any prayer. When the German soldier reached for her wrist, she didn't see the uniform. She saw trembling fingers, human and frail, like her younger brothers back home in Iowa. In that instant, she realized that war had stolen not only lives but distinctions, between good and evil, between us and them. She had treated American soldiers who cried out for their mothers in pain. Now the same sound came from the lips of an enemy boy. The uniform changed nothing. That was the cruel symmetry of the front. And as she held him, she felt something that the textbooks never described: compassion and helplessness, locked together. In her training, she had been told to detach to remain professional, but on that frozen Christmas Eve she understood that detachment was a lie. Compassion was the only thing keeping her human. The soldier she treated had been part of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, thrown into the Ardennes in December as part of Hitler's desperate gamble. He was 19. He'd been drafted 6 months earlier, trained for only 3 weeks, and sent straight into the forest with a rifle that jammed in the cold. To the Allied soldiers who fought them, the Volksgrenadiers were ghosts, young, underfed, wearing mismatched uniforms, some still carrying schoolbooks in their packs. Yet they fought with the ferocity of men who had no choice. Behind them stood the SS and military police ready to shoot any deserter. This boy had been caught in an ambush 2 days earlier when his unit tried to take a crossroads west of Bastogne. His wound was fatal, a chest shot from an American bar gunner. When he was found, he was half-conscious, clutching a photograph of his parents. For him, the war had already ended. German soldiers were told that American medics would let them die. Propaganda said the Allies showed no mercy. But when he opened his eyes and saw the nurse's face, something broke inside him. He realized his captors were not monsters. They were people. That realization was both comforting and unbearable. He spoke little English, just enough to say, "Tell them, I was brave." He wanted his family to remember him as a soldier, not as a boy dying in a foreign tent. His plea wasn't about glory, it was about dignity. In that moment, he wasn't fighting for Hitler or the Reich. He was fighting against being forgotten. Behind the human tragedy lay the machinery of war, cold, methodical, relentless. The field hospital where this encounter took place was part of the 326th Airborne Medical Company, operating just outside Bastogne. These mobile hospitals were designed to move quickly, following the battle lines, providing first aid and surgery as close to the front as possible. But during the siege, they couldn't move. German artillery had cut off every road. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were almost gone. The last drops of plasma were thawed over candle flames. For the doctors and nurses, medicine had become triage under fire. Each stretcher that entered the tent brought a decision. Who could be saved, who could not? It was a brutal arithmetic of survival. In military terms, every minute mattered. A nurse had to stop bleeding within 60 seconds. A medic had to evacuate a casualty within 15 minutes or the man would die of shock. But during Bastogne, evacuation was impossible. Men died waiting. Under these conditions, the role of the nurse expanded beyond medicine. They became anchors, voices that steadied soldiers as shells fell outside. Some called them angels in mud. Others called them the last thing they saw before dying. The tactical reality shaped everything. It wasn't courage that kept them going. It was momentum. Stop moving and you thought too much. Think too much and you broke. That's why when the German soldier grabbed her wrist, the nurse didn't react with anger or fear. She reacted with instinct. The same instinct that had driven her through hundreds of other moments. Help, stabilize, comfort. In war, compassion was not a weakness. It was discipline. And that discipline, that quiet humanity amid procedure, made her answer to him inevitable. The snow outside thickened. The gunfire drew closer. Inside, the lanterns flickered as if about to give out. The German soldier whispered again, his strength fading. And somewhere in the dim light, the nurse took a breath, ready to speak the words that would haunt her forever. The moral angle. By the first week of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. What remained was ruin. The Ardennes forest, once a quiet landscape of pines and stone villages, had become a graveyard. Trees were splintered by shell fire. Roads were lined with burned-out tanks and frozen bodies locked in strange, contorted stillness. The air still carried the smell of cordite and decay. The official reports called it a victory. The Allied lines had held. The German offensive had failed. But among those who had lived through it, victory was just another word for survival. In the field hospitals, the nurses worked for days without rest, cataloging the aftermath. They filled out casualty cards, tagged the dead, prepared the living for evacuation. For many, it was the first time they had been able to stop. And stopping meant feeling. The nurse from Bastogne didn't sleep. She kept her hands busy, folding blankets, cleaning instruments, writing down patient numbers that no longer mattered. When the doctors finally ordered the corpses to be buried, she stood outside and watched the frozen stretchers carried into the ground. Each one disappeared beneath the snow, like a page turned quietly in a book no one wanted to finish. Reports from the U.S. Army Medical Department recorded that during the 6 weeks of fighting in the Ardennes, more than 89,000 American casualties were treated, including over 19,000 dead. German losses were even higher, with nearly 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. But statistics could not describe what it felt like inside those tents. One Red Cross report described it simply: "The air was so cold our breath froze on our masks. We worked until we forgot our names." The nurse was transferred soon after to another aid station near the town of Ettelbruck, Luxembourg. There she continued the same work, different faces, same wounds. Yet something had changed inside her. She no longer wrote letters home as often. When she did, they were brief, factual. Her words had lost their warmth. Those who served beside her noticed it too. One fellow nurse later said of her, "She was efficient, brave, calm, but her eyes never softened again." It was as if she left something behind in Bastogne. The army sent commendations to the surviving nurses after the siege, small, official gestures of gratitude. But medals meant little to those who had spent weeks among the dying. Their reward was simply to keep breathing. In March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine into Germany, the nurses followed. The field hospitals grew larger, better supplied but no less grim. Disease, infection, frostbite, and starvation. The wounds changed, but the suffering did not. The German army was collapsing. POW camps overflowed. Thousands of enemy wounded arrived each day, and the nurses treated them all. Men who only weeks earlier had tried to kill them. And still, she remembered the boy in the snow. Some nights she thought she saw his face in every German patient who reached for her hand. Sometimes she almost told them that she had known one of their own, that she had seen his fear, that she had not hated him. But she never did. She had learned that war was not about hatred. It was about endurance. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, she was stationed near Frankfurt. The victory celebrations barely reached the medical wards. The nurses worked through the night, tending to those who would never go home, on either side. When the message came over the radio, "The war in Europe is over," she simply set down her instruments and stared at her hands. They were shaking. She couldn't tell if it was from relief or emptiness. For the rest of her shift, she said nothing. She just worked. That night, for the first time in months, she opened her journal. She wrote only one line: "The guns have stopped, but the noise inside never will." The war ended, but it never truly left her. When she finally boarded the ship home in late 1945, she expected joy. The docks of New York were crowded with flags, brass bands, and tears. Reporters shouted questions at soldiers stepping off the gangplanks. "How does it feel to be home?" But no one asked the nurses. She stepped onto American soil wearing a uniform still creased with European mud. Her hands trembled as she touched the railing. The smell of the ocean reminded her of ether. The cheering felt distant, unreal, like sound coming through water. Home was quieter than she remembered. Streets were clean, faces were warm, but she felt like a ghost walking among the living. People thanked her for her service, and she smiled. But inside she could still hear the steady rhythm of field hospitals, the heartbeat of suffering that had never stopped. At night, she dreamed of snow. The image always returned: the tent, the cold, the boy's face. Sometimes he asked her again to tell his family he was brave. Sometimes she lied and he smiled. Other nights she told him the truth and his eyes closed without peace. She would wake up gasping, her hands reaching for bandages that weren't there. Like many veterans, she tried to build a new life. She worked in a hospital in Chicago, then later as a nurse instructor. Her students admired her calmness, the way she handled emergencies with quiet certainty. They never guessed that her calm came from having already seen the worst that human beings could do to each other. When asked about the war, she spoke little. Once, during a lecture, a young student asked, "What's the hardest part of nursing in wartime?" She paused, the chalk still in her hand. Then she said softly, "Remembering that everyone you treat has a mother somewhere." The class fell silent. She turned back to the board. That was all she said. Years passed. The world moved on. The war became history, then memory, then story. The men who had fought returned to families, to farms, to jobs. The nurses faded quietly into the background, their names forgotten, their service buried beneath medals and myths. In the 1950s, a letter arrived from Germany. It was addressed to the U.S. Army Medical Service, Bastogne, Belgium, December 1944. Somehow, through clerical miracle or fate, it found its way to her. It was written in careful English, signed by a woman named Clara. She was searching for information about her son, a 19-year-old soldier who had never come home. She wrote, "If anyone remembers him, please tell me if he was afraid. Please tell me if he suffered." The nurse held the letter for a long time before replying. Then finally she sat down and wrote, "He was not alone. He was cared for. He was not forgotten." It was the only letter she ever sent to Germany. She never told Clara what she had said that night. Some truths belong to the living. Others belong to the dead. But after sending the letter, she slept through the night for the first time in years. In 1962, she visited Europe again, part of a reunion for veterans and medical staff. She traveled to Belgium, to the forests of the Ardennes, where the snow had long melted into quiet fields. Near Bastogne, a small stone monument marked where the 101st Airborne had held the line. She walked alone among the markers, her footsteps soft in the grass. And then she saw it, a modest granite cross among many, bearing only one word, unbekannt, unknown. She knelt beside it. The air was still, filled with the hum of distant wind through pine trees. For a moment she imagined she could hear the faint breath of the dying, not ghosts but echoes of compassion. She placed a white lily at the base of the stone. Her hand lingered there, trembling slightly. "Rest," she whispered. "You don't have to be brave anymore." She died many years later, quietly in her sleep. Among her few belongings was a small leather pouch. Inside, folded and yellowed, was a photograph of a German farmhouse, a man, a woman, and their son standing together in sunlight. No one in her family knew who they were. But in that single photograph lay everything she had carried, the burden, the mercy, the truth, and somewhere in the stillness of memory, the boy's last breath and her final whisper became one. The sound of hum, the years erased the names, the faces, the details. But the story remained, a fragment of compassion in the coldest winter of the war. Because even in the world's darkest hours, there were those who chose not to hate, and that choice, small, quiet, unseen, was how the world began to heal. Anity surviving war. History remembers wars by the battles that defined them, by the maps redrawn, the nations rebuilt, the flags raised in victory. But beneath those headlines lie moments that never make it to the books, moments that belong only to the silence between heartbeats. One of those moments was a young nurse holding the hand of a dying enemy in a snowbound tent. No medals were given for it. No speeches were made, yet it carried the weight of everything humanity still hoped to be. War strips people to their essence. It tears away language, country, ideology, until what remains is one person trying to comfort another as the world collapses around them. That perhaps is the truest kind of courage. Not the act of killing, but the act of caring when everything tells you not to. The nurse never saw herself as a hero. She never sought recognition, but her small defiance and refusing to let hate define her was a victory of another kind. It was the kind that doesn't end when the shooting stops. Her words, "You don't have to be brave anymore," were meant for him, but in time, they came to speak for millions. For the soldiers who returned home broken, for the nurses who couldn't forget, for every survivor who learned that surviving was its own kind of battle. In the long shadow of history, that sentence became something greater, a truth about war itself. That even amid destruction, compassion endures, that even among enemies, humanity survives. The fields of the Ardennes are quiet now. The snow falls softly over the forests where men once died for inches of frozen ground. Tourists walk among memorials, reading names carved in stone. But the names that matter most are the ones history never learned. Somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear it still, the soft whisper of a nurse to a dying boy, reminding the world that mercy can exist even in hell, because wars end. Nations heal, but compassion, that fragile, stubborn spark, is what makes humanity worth saving.